Hello again, hello again, guys, and welcome back to another Big Al Devlin video. And thank you very much for tuning in. So, in the last video that I filmed, which was the Aesir Vanir War, I promised you that I would do a video considering in more detail the gods that that comprised the pantheons that I just described. Now I've realised, obviously, I've bitten off a little bit more than I could chew to do in one video. In fact, actually, it's going to be probably more like 5 videos, because to do the gods themselves justice, some of the gods have a lot to talk about, especially the big ones like Odin, Thor, Tyr, Loki, Freya. They're all videos in their own right, and then maybe some of the lesser ones like Baldur, Heimdall in Dunbragi, Njord, maybe, for example. They might all be able to be clumped up together in one video, but I feel it's better anyway for you guys, because we all have affinity to a certain god or another. We all have a favourite, you could be Odin, it could be Thor, it could be Freya. It doesn't really matter who your favourite is. You might not have a complete favourite, but you'll have someone who you feel a particular affinity for, and it'd be nice for you guys to just be able to go, I'm going to listen about them today, and just be able to click a video just on them. And so really, I think this is for the best anyway, to separate the gods into their own videos, and it allows me to cover each of the gods in significant detail also, especially, as I say, the big ones like Odin, which is the one we're starting with today. Odin, there's a lot to talk about, okay, and I'm reading not from just my notes, but also some other written notes that I have here that I've managed to get my hands on from a friend. And so if sometimes it looks like I'm reading like someone else's stuff, it is because I am. I'm trying to translate their handwriting, but I asked for help on it because some of the language issues, for example, some of the stuff that I found was really good, but it was like in German and stuff, and I don't speak that kind of stuff, so I had a little bit of help. Okay, so we're going to start with Odin. Okay, Odin was typically known as the Allfather, and was the king of the gods of Asgard. Okay, he ruled over both the Aesir and the Vanir within Asgard, which was one of the 9 realms. But he was also not just a god that sat on a throne and ruled from his throne, doing administrative stuff, things like this, preparing his armies or anything like that. He was a god that did travel, and he intermingled with not just our own realm, but all the different realms quite regularly. He travelled the cosmos very, very much. He was very much, well, he's sometimes known as the traveller. That's how some people would describe him. And he was a very contradictory character, to believe it or not. A very colourful character. He had glaring contradictory elements to his personality, almost as if, like, not bipolar, but almost like he had 2 personalities ultimately. The noble king who would rule with purity, and then the trickster who would have complete disregard for any law or any form of justice in any way whatsoever, as long as it got what he wanted, which for him was wisdom. And so it was weird, because he would punish people for breaking his own laws, but he had complete disregard for other people's laws. I suppose that was the advantage of being the king of gods, I suppose. But we're going to go into a little bit about his personality, some of the quirks that he developed over time, because of course, believe it or not, he was part of much more than just Nordic culture. He's part of Anglo-Saxon culture. He was part of Germanic culture, and he was English culture as well. So which was Anglo-Saxon. So Anglo-Saxon, German culture, Nordic culture, both all had Odin. He's part of 3 major groups of people, and obviously each of those different groups of people would have seen him possibly in a slightly different way, but ultimately the whole picture remained the same. Now, I'm then going to describe him in his various aspects. He was a god of war, and I'll go on how he acted in war. He was a god that represented sovereignty. So if you were a ruler, he was your patron god. If you were an Anglo-Saxon or a Viking king, Odin would be your god for certain, despite the fact he was also the god of tricksters. Well, I say tricksters, but sort of travellers, outlaws, that kind of thing. People who just might have existed in society, but outcasts, that's the word I'm looking for. He was a god of outcasts. So he was a god of king, yet the god of outcasts as well. People who might have lived in society but were kind of shunned by society, he was equally as much for them as he was for the king who ruled over them. So he was an unusual god. He was also, just like Freya, a very strong practitioner of magic. And he was able to practice Seda in many forms. He wasn't as good as Freya, but he was pretty good at doing it. And he, he became stronger as he got older and wiser, so we say. And so he was shamanistic in many respects. And so we'll discuss him in his how he would be looked at or worshipped as if you were a magic user, which were, they existed back in then. He was also, a poet. We might not go into that, but he was also a poet, and quite a well-known poet as well. And he had a love for poetry, and of course he had a major interaction with the dead, and with that I'm talking about Valhalla. And of course that will be a video in its own right. Valhalla there's a lot to talk about. And then of course he was known simply as the Allfather, and we'll discuss why that was the case, because there are potentially different reasons as to why he was the Allfather, but it's pretty simple really. He's the father of everything. I mean, it's pretty much in the name. He wasn't the father of all the gods, because of course his grandfather was, but he was he created men, at least anyway. So he was our All-Father. He forged us from trees, didn't he? If you don't know that, then please watch my cosmology video that I've done on Viking cosmology. You'll see that we were created from trees, and he created the world. He created Midgard. He was quite an influential god. He did a lot in the time that he had, because of course eventually he does die in Ragnarok. Okay, and he's killed by Fenrir, who tears his throat out like a vicious beast that he was. So Odin had a variety of different names. In Old Saxon, which is English essentially, he was known as Woden. In Old High German, he was known as Wotan, Wotan or Woden. And in Pro-Germanic, I have no idea how to pronounce this, but it looks like Wodenas, which literally translates as the master of ecstasy. I don't know why that comes from that, whether that's to do with his magic or something along those lines, or whether, for example, one way that you could feel closer to Odin was to eat magic mushrooms, believe it or not. That's what is believed that berserkers did, who were very, very much dedicated to Odin. And so obviously he might have obviously had an involvement. He might have been essentially the god of drugs back in the old days when they didn't know what drugs were, when they just ate a plant and got high and like, wow, that's a good plant, I'll eat that again. Okay, so he might have been involved in that as well. Now, he was the ruler of the Aesir tribe of deities, but he did venture very far from his kingdom. As I say, he was a solitary wanderer who walked across and travelled across and throughout the entire cosmos in purely self-interested quests. He didn't do it for anyone else, just for himself. And he was a relentless seeker and giver of wisdom, but he had little regard for communal values. So, for example, he had little regard for justice, fairness, or respect for law and convention. He didn't give a shit basically about the laws of men. For example, if he went to another realm, for example, Valheim, he wouldn't respect the Vanerian law, for example. He'd do what he wanted. Okay, but obviously in his own land he was king, and so you broke his law, you got punished. So he was quite contrasting in many ways. He was also, as a result, being the king of Asgard, the divine patron god of rulers. But as I said before, he was also the god of outcasts. He was the god of war, but also a god of poetry, you know, and he actually possessed quite prominent effeminate features that no Norse or Germanic warrior would ever allow amongst themselves. For example, and I'm not talking the poetry, we'll get into that later on, but he practiced Seder, for example, and Seder was banned amongst men. Men could do it, but if they did it, they were no longer seen as men. It was only for women, you know, for example. So he had no problems doing what were essentially effeminate things also, if it got him what he wanted. Okay, and he was, you know, even though he was worshipped by those who were in search of prestige, honor, and nobility, he was also cursed for being a fickle trickster also. So I believe a good representation of him, certainly as the fickle trickster, would be actually, if you watch American Gods, they do a very good representation of him as the trickster. I don't think they do a good representation of him as the ruler. We'll see. We'll see how it progresses if they do a second, third season and all the rest of it. But at the moment, there's only one season, but they do a very good version of him as a trickster, and the god of outcasts. And it's very interesting because they represent a lot of the qualities I've just described there. Now, of course, he was the god of war, and he was seen as being entirely honourable ruler and battlefield and an honourable combatant, and a very good battlefield commander also. And he was also incredibly muscular, so he was powerful and strong. He wasn't as strong as Thor, but he was a force to be reckoned with, and he would be able to beat most other gods in physical combat. But to the ancient Norse, he was, you know, nothing like that. That's what modern pop culture represents him as. Instead, he was simply just a straightforward noble war god, such as Tyr or Thor, and he didn't win his battles by being impossibly muscular and all the rest of it. He won it just by being more clever than his opponent. Okay, so when he went to war, he just outsmarted them. And he used his strength. He was a ruler. He didn't have to fight. He had people like Thor and Tyr who could fight for him. So he would use them to fight for him. And then, of course, in Ragnarok, he has the souls of dead men who died in battlefield, and died bravely in battle. And he had a whole army to help protect him against Fenrir. And he let them do the fighting. He let them do the commanding if needs be, if they were better at doing it than him, because he knew sometimes, you know, like I say, when you're the god of wisdom, the wisest thing is to defer to someone who's actually better at doing something than yourself. You don't have to do everything, you know. You pick the best man for the job, and that's exactly what he was. He did not do what a modern presentation represents him as this, you know, big hulking, you know, that was Thor, not Odin. Okay, sometimes you do get Odin represented as a, you know, a very strong melee combatant. He would have been able to handle himself, but you know, he simply wasn't a fighter, you know, in that sense. It wasn't important to him. But Odin had no interest in average fighters. Okay, had no interest whatsoever in average fighters, and simply he would lavish instead his blessings. So if he could, you know, bless or, you know, help, for example, or assist someone who was worthy of his assistance, it would be those who didn't need it, who were already capable of, you know, taking armies on by themselves, so to speak. He liked good warriors. He liked fearsome warriors, warriors who knew no fear and would pile into the enemy and really give them a good bashing. And if they died, well, no problem to him. He'd take their souls and bring them to Valhalla. That was no problem to him whatsoever. So he had no interest in the average. It was only the exceptional. So if you were just a normal guy who could fight and you fight fairly well, you weren't suitable for Odin. You had to be exceptional. Okay. And he actually maintained very close affiliations with a group called the Berserkers, or sometimes they're known as warrior shamans, whose fighting technique associated spiritual practice around their fighting techniques, and also around achieving a state of ecstatic unification with a certain ferocious totem, for example, like animals, usually wolves or bears, and by extension Odin himself, who was master of such beasts. So Odin was, I mean, for example, if you were a berserker, and this is why I say my family, like I know my family were dedicated to Odin. It is heavily believed that a large proportion of my ancestors were berserkers. That's why I feel that I would be a follower of Odin, because I'd have to follow their path, just like I should do. And the berserker was, I am a warrior myself in many respects. I fight in the ring, and so he wanted, as I say, these aggressive fighters who would enter an ecstasy of blood rage, essentially. Many people say that they would, take magic mushrooms or some form of drug to hit this ecstasy. I really don't think they did. I think they just got off on their spiritualistic ecstasy of belief, and their belief that Odin was wanting them to be like this, that they were happy because battle was coming, and they would finally maybe get a chance to meet their master, because they wanted to die in combat, but they wanted to die in combat after killing a good 50 or 60 of you. They had to fight exceptionally well, and to do that you can't fear death. And they didn't fear death because to them death was something they wanted. Dying of old age would be the worst thing possible for these men. So when you've got warriors like that who actually want to fight and die in the battlefield, it's hard to deal with them, because then they especially when they are very well trained as well, they would be incredibly well drilled fighters. They'd be more than a handful, definitely. And so you find in history there are groups of people who dedicate themselves to the war aspect of Odin, and they were, as I say, the berserkers, and they were Viking. Okay. And of course he also had patronage to sovereign, and so if you were a ruler, or any form of king or chieftain or anything like that, amongst your people during ancient times, Odin would be by default your patron god, or should I say Odin would be your patron god? No, he wouldn't necessarily. There were one of two choices. It's not just in the Germanic peoples either, so it's not just in the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and all the rest of it, but also in all of the branches of the Indo-European people that come from the same roots as the Vikings. They all shared a three-tiered social political hierarchy, where at the top, the very first tier consisted of rulers, and the second tier was warriors, and the third was that of farmers and other occupations of production. And if you at the top tier, your patron god was one of two. It was either Odin or Tyr, and both equally were worshipped and were both patron gods of that very first tier that I described, the ruler tier of society. However, the main difference is that tier was much more for rulers who ruled by law and justice, where Odin was for the rulers who had much more due, um, who ruled more for cunning, so we say, more than anything else, or even magic, if that's what you believed in. If you used alternative means to keep your power, because I mean these were vicious times, these were violent times, so you know, keeping your power in, like we've all seen probably Game of Thrones, it was like that, you know, you had to fight to keep your power, and if you kept it by being liked by your subjects and using law and order to keep them in check, then Tyr would be instead your patron god. But if you were much more innovative, so we say, on how you kept power by assassinating potential people who would try and take your power, for example, or whether it be through heavy, you know, distracting the people, for example, by having raids, more raids than ever, and things like that. You know, using cunning, using intelligence to rule, rather than, even if they hated you, they still accepted you as king because, well, you made them rich, for example. Then Odin was actually your patron god, because that's what he was good at. And as I say, I mean, paradoxically, our Odin was also the favourite god and helper of outlaws, not only because he himself was also a traveller, but he had a particular affinity for outlaws who had been banished from society for a very, you know, heinous crime. And the reason is such is because such men had to become very strong-willed individuals if they wanted to sort of survive in the wilderness, or, you know, for whatever means necessary. And Odin did believe in achieving what you need to achieve through whatever means necessary. He was not a king who messed around. As I said, you know, if you want law and order, that's Tyr. But if you want to be, you know, achieve whatever through, and you don't care who gets hurt, then obviously Odin is your patron god, and that's why he also, as I say, was very much a patron god of outlaws as much as kings, which is, you know, almost paradoxical in nature. And even because amongst his own travels, the Aesir were very honourable and noble people, in many respects, and the Asgardians as a whole, even the Vanir, you know, they had taken on the noble aspect of being the rulers, as essentially, of the 9 realms. And there is actually a Saxo Grammaticus tale of Odin himself becoming outlawed from Asgard for 10 years. The reason as such is because he did nothing wrong. He didn't do anything wrong. It's just simply because the other gods and goddesses didn't want to be tarnished by the vile reputation he had acquired amongst many humans. So when Odin went on his travels, he basically, when he was in Asgard, he was a good king. But when he was in the mortal realms, I think it was almost like holiday time for him, if you know what I mean. No, he misbehaved. And had a horrible reputation amongst mortal, you know, in the way that he acted amongst mortal men. But when within Asgard, he, you know, was this noble king. As I say, it's almost like he had a dual personality, or split personality in many respects. And Odin, I mean, there's a passage that describes it very well. Odin believed that whatever their social stature, men and women favoured by himself, by Odin, are distinguished by their intelligence, creativity, and competence in the proverbial war of against all. Literally, the war of all against all, essentially. Whether such people become kings or criminals is mostly a matter of luck. That's how he saw it. And so he had no issue whether you're king, outlaw, criminal, whatever. it didn't really matter. But it was just pure luck, and that was it. And he didn't want to be just, you know, the worshipped by kings just because they were born to the right people. No, he wanted to also be there for the common man also, and that's why he was, again, allowed himself to intermingle with parts of society that the other gods didn't approve of, even because he just saw them as being as strong as the kings themselves, if not stronger, because of course they had to survive for whatever means necessary. And of course, Odin is also heavily associated with wisdom. He's known as the god of wisdom, and for good reason as well. But he's also, you know, associated with magic and shamanism also, which is less well known. I mean, it's something that even myself, I didn't really know until I started to research it for you guys here now. I thought it was mainly the Vanir who practiced Sadir and shamanism and other magics. I thought the Aesir just didn't practice it at all, or in only minor amounts, you know, or only in its way that it could be displayed in nature, like, you know, by creating thunderbolts and things like that, or much more sort of obvious versions of magic, much more destructive forms of magic, forms of magic that can be used in war, for example. No, Odin was very much not like that. He actually did pursue, as I say, his wisdom, but he also pursued knowledge of magic also. And that is one of the greatest differences between both monotheistic religions and theologies, like, you know, Judeo-Christianity and polytheistic theologies, is that in the former, God is generally, as I've said before, all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. He's a supreme being. But polytheistic gods, like Odin, are not. They're limited, like just like a human being. They have a plateau of what they can achieve at maximum, and they are limited as a result by their own limitations. Okay, but to Odin, any kind of limitation was something that must be overcome by any means necessary. And his obsession with this overcoming his limitations, or other people's limitations, or the limitations of whatever was in front of him, was again why he was, when he was travelling through the cosmos, and certainly amongst mortal men, he often found himself with outlaws. And of course, as a result, he's almost like an adventurer in many ways. He goes on these, you know, personal quests, where he goes on these relentless and ruthless quests for more wisdom, more knowledge, and more power, and, as I say, usually of the magical sort. And one of the most striking attributes of his appearance is, of course, his single piercing eye. If anyone's ever seen an image of Odin, if you haven't, go on Google now and put Odin in, and you'll notice he's always got only one eye. I believe it was his right eye that he sacrificed, and he actually sacrificed his eye for the ultimate wisdom, the knowledge of how he would die. He actually, it's another story, but basically in summarization, he went to the three Norns, I believe, who tend to the bottom of the world tree, where the waters that feed the world tree exist, and within these waters there is fate. You know, you can read and see fate, and he basically made a bargain with them. And as I say, I'll tell you the full story in another video. Basically, where he said, well, if I sacrifice my eye, will you let me drink of the water, or, you know, partake of the water? Yeah, well, yeah, okay, if you're going to take your eye out, you might, yeah, whatever. And he does. He just puts his fingers straight in his skull, takes his eye out, permanently removes it. And as a result, because a deal is a deal, the Norns are obliged to let him look within the strands of fate and within the waters of fate at the bottom of Yggdrasil. And so by doing that, that's when he finds out, he gains ultimate wisdom at that point. He knows everything that's going to happen in his life, including his own death. He sees his own fate, and that's when he creates Valhalla, actually, because that's when he finds out that he's going to get killed by Fenrir. And so he decides, well, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to change fate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recruit the souls of every mortal man that fights like a badass motherfucker, basically, and I'm going to make an army out of them, and they're going to protect me against Fenrir when Ragnarok finally comes. I'm going to change fate. Of course, he doesn't achieve that, because fate is fate. You're born and you die, and those dates, they never change. Yes, okay, you might be able to alter it partly with Seder magic, but those particular dates, your birth and your death, they're unchangeable, okay, even for the gods themselves. But an interesting story nonetheless that I'll tell you at another time. It's a very, very interesting story, that one. On another occasion, Odin literally sacrificed himself to himself. And again, I'll tell you this story in more detail later in another video, but he hangs himself on the world tree, which is called Yggdrasil, for 9 days and 9 nights, and receiving no form of nourishment from his companions. At the end of the ordeal, he is able to perceive the runes, the magically charged ancient Germanic alphabet that was held to contain many of the greatest secrets of existence, and he's depicted as having subsequently boasted, "Then I was fertilized and grew wise. From a world to a world I was led to a word. From a word to a word I was led to a word. From a work to a work I was led to a work." Basically, he's showing off and saying, basically, I learned a lot. He hung himself, and in doing so, because he sacrificed himself to himself, just like if you make a sacrifice to a god, you tend to get something back for it. Because he sacrificed himself to himself, he gained this incredible amount of wisdom. Whether that wisdom was, you don't hang yourself, mate. You know, you are immortal. Hanging yourself's not going to kill you anyway, probably. I don't know. Maybe that was the wisdom. Don't hang yourself, it hurts. I don't know. But no, in all seriousness, he did gain some wisdom, because he did it off the world tree Yggdrasil, and as I say, through Yggdrasil run the waters. Ran through Yggdrasil was the waters that fate could be read through. In addition to that, Odin's competitive side once drove him to a challenge where he challenged the wisest of the giants to a contest to see who was most knowledgeable and learned. The prize was literally the head of the loser, so whoever lost was going to die. Okay, and Odin won by asking his opponent something that only he himself could know. Again, I'll tell you that story fully in full detail at another time, but you know, it's kind of cheating really when you ask someone a question where literally no one will know apart from you. It's like, you know, I don't know, innermost secret or desire, I don't know, whatever question he asked, we'll find out when I do that story, because I've not heard that story. That I've heard of it before, but I don't know it in detail. But then after doing so, Odin then claimed his prize and returned to Asgard. Along with Freya, he is also one of the 2 great practitioners of shamanism amongst the gods. Now, practicing Seder, as I say, or shamanism, Norse shamanism, was something that was actually only able to be done by women. Men could do it, and men did do it, but in your eyes of society, you were no longer a man. Okay, you were not allowed to practice magic as a man. That was for women only. But Odin didn't care, so he practiced his shamanistic Seder magic, and developed it to almost Freya's capability. Freya was the best with that magic form, but he was second best, which is saying something, because there were a lot of strong practitioners amongst the Vanir tribe. And Odin, like a lot of shamans all over the world, accompanied he was accompanied by familiar spirits, most notably his ravens, Hugin and Mungin. Okay, Hugin and Munin, the wolves, Jerry and Freki, and of course the Valkyries themselves. So all of those things that I mentioned just there are actually familial spirits. Because he was a practitioner of Seder, he was surrounded by these spirits, and he had his ravens, Hugin and Munin, which literally translates to thought and memory, and they were extensions of his own mind. So when he slept, he could actually watch it. He could literally see everything that happened within his realm, and he could watch everyone and everything. But Jerry and Freki were his two dogs, but I didn't actually know they were familiars. I actually just thought they were just dogs, but they were actually his familiars also. And also the Valkyries. That I had no idea. I always wondered where the Valkyries came from. I never questioned really I did question their origin, but I never questioned it too far. But they existed because of his practice of magic, and obviously he used them to pick men off the battlefield who he thought were worthy of fighting in Valhalla and fighting for him in Ragnarok. He used the Valkyries to bring their souls back to his hall. So that's really interesting to learn. So I've actually learned something there. Okay, through this research. That was, as I say, not all this research is mine. Some of it has been given to me. Okay, now the shaman must typically undergo a ritual death and rebirth in order to acquire his or her powers, and Odin underwent exactly such an ordeal when he discovered the runes. So that's why he hung himself. Okay, and that's when he saw through the runes. He hung himself from Yggdrasil, which I mentioned earlier, so that he could become a shaman, because to be able to practice magic you must first die and be reborn, which essentially only the gods could really do. And as I said, his magic also included that of Seder. And I keep mentioning Seder because it is a very powerful form of magic, because there are other magics, as I say, all gods have some form of magic, whether it's changing shape, forming lightning bolts, like Thor could do, for example, or whatever it might be, influencing the minds of mortals, for example, creating fear, whatever it might be. But Seder was a magic that was very powerful because it allowed you to possibly influence fate. And as I said, it was a magic that was the only magic that was banned to men. It was only typically practiced by females. But the sagas show very clearly that didn't stop men practicing Seder. But when they did, their position within society was, forever, tarnished, shall we say, and they were seen as being unmanly, and they were taunted from adopting the female traits and performing feminine tasks that would form the backbone of Seder, because the practitioner of Seder would often there was often the description of being or ritual fertilization. So I'll leave that to your own imagination. So you probably have to pretend that you're being impregnated by, or actually have sexual relations with, obviously, another man. But I believe it was all ritualistic in many respects. But I'm not obviously an expert on Seder, but I will read up on it for you guys and give you a video on that as well if it's of interest. One thing that most people didn't probably know is that actually Odin only ever speaks in poems, and the ability to compose poetry is a gift he grants at his pleasure. So he'd be a pain in the ass to talk to, I can imagine, because I like straight talking people. As much as I would respect, obviously, my God, you can imagine him talking to you in poems all the time. It'd be like living with Jay-Z or something. Poor Beyonce. That's all I'm saying. But I'm bringing in pop culture, modern stuff there. Right, so obviously his influence with the dead, okay, was important to understand. All. What's interesting when it comes to dead is when Roman writers speak of the gods, or write of the gods and goddesses of other peoples, they generally try to identify them with the deities of their own religion. So they were trying to sort of draw parallels. Oh, so that god must be like their equivalent of this god. You know, this must be like Jupiter, for example, and all the rest of it. Now, when they mention Odin, and this was in the case with pretty much every Roman writer, they actually gloss him as Mercury, who was the divine figure who helps guide those who have just died from the realm of the living to that of the dead in due time back to the land of the living again. This is significant because, you know, at the end of the day, it shows that Odin's associations with death and the guiding of the people who have just died to Valhalla, for example, were seen as being more significant in his associations with war, or else he would have been simply glossed as Mars, but that fell to either normally tier or 4. So what's interesting is an outside perspective also um, of an ancient people who existed at the same time as the Vikings. They saw him more of a god of death rather than a god of war. And obviously that's because when they fought, they would have seen that obviously their warriors would give praise to Odin when they died. You know, I must go to Valhalla. I must see Odin. You know, and so they'd probably see him as some form of a guider of the deaf. With his Valkyries, his familiar, who was his spell familiars and stuff, guiding the dead. It's just nice to see an outside perspective on who were very familiar, obviously, the more familiar with the actual real Vikings, saying that no, he wasn't the god of war, he was the god of death. It's interesting. Now, Odin presided over a hall called Valhalla, the most prestigious of the dwelling places of the dead. Okay. Arguably that might not be correct because obviously Freya also had a hall where the dead would also go, but it was still, nonetheless, it was the most prestigious. We know that because otherwise documentation would still be around of Freya's hall also, unless there's some conspiracy theory going on there, I don't know. After every battle, Odin and his helping spirits, the Valkyries, who is literally translated as choosers of the fallen, comb the field and take their pick of half of the slain warriors back to Valhalla. And as I said, Freya had a choice of the other half, and she had first choice also. That was part of their treaty that after the Aesir-Vanir War, that Freya gets the first pickings of any dead warriors. Okay. Now, Odin was a very frequent recipient of human sacrifice, especially of royalty, nobles, and enemy armies. This was generally accompanied by means of spear or noose or both. So basically, when you were sacrificed to Odin, you were hung ultimately, or stuck with a spear. His mastery of necromancy, the magical art of communicating with raising the dead, is also frequently noted. So I mentioned in the Aesir-Vanir War that he was capable of reincarnating almost, bringing back to life almost the head of Mimir, his friend, who was very wise and had been beheaded by the Vanir, and he obviously had some power of necromancy there, but it was also frequently noted that he did that more than one time, obviously. Now, one of the reasons, and of course there's always a reason behind everything that Odin does, and that's what makes him interesting. He's not just a god who does things because, well, that's the right thing to do. He does it because it's what he wants to do, and it will lead to, it will have consequences that will lead to him advancing himself, or his knowledge, or his wisdom. And so his knowledge of necromancy, he only developed it so that he would be able to converse with the dead and learn from them their own knowledge and wisdom that they possessed. And you know, he was quite a character in that sense, in my opinion. Quite a character. Learning necromancy just so you can speak to the dead to learn things. But you know, that's the whole point of Odin. Everything, he was driven. He was driven by whatever his ambitions were, and that was wisdom and knowledge. To him, anything, but he would sacrifice even himself, even his own body parts, for more wisdom, more knowledge. To him, that was the ultimate pursuit. Okay. Now, the last point to make is in his reference as allfather. According to Snorri Sturluson, he was the father of all the gods. Now, of course, that's not true. He was the grandson of Bori, wasn't he? But he was the father of all humans. And ultimately, he did create humans, and he was the king of all the gods. And what I would interpret it as personally is, who do we see typically as our father figure? Someone who we fear, because if we do wrong, he'll discipline us. Ultimately, Odin could do that. He had no problem disciplining people in some respect. But it was more to the fact that most people don't fear their fathers as a primary feeling. That their first feeling is love, and they desire to impress them. As a young child, you want nothing more than your father to go, "Well done, son, I'm proud of you." And that is my reason why he was called the Allfather, is because every single warrior wanted to impress Odin so that he'd get into Valhalla. That's what makes him the Allfather, in my opinion, because everyone who fought, everyone who died in battle, hoped that they had impressed him enough to catch his eye and for him to go, "Yes, I want you," you know. And obviously, as well as that, as I say, because he created mankind. I'm going to leave it there, guys. I've done 50 minutes there, and I'm knackered, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, so I don't think I'm getting any more videos out. I was hoping to cover all the gods, but it's amazing how long these videos take, and you can probably see the tiredness in my eyes. And I can hear my dog crying downstairs. I think he misses me. So I'm going to go now, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Any further comments you wish to add, please put them in below. If you've got any more information or references to books or articles which should be useful for anyone to read, please share them in below. If you just want to give your compliments and thumbs up, then that's appreciated as well. That spurs me on to make more and more videos. And if you've got any video ideas or any content that you want me to cover, please put that in the comments below as well. I do go through them quite often, and I don't always notice everything, but eventually I do go through virtually every comment on there. Depends how many trolls are on here. If we get people insulting us, then I tend to ignore the comments to some degree, but I do still have a look for the good guys out there like yourself. Nice one. Bye bye.